All right, hi everybody, and welcome again to the Popular Music Books in Process series. As always, it's a joint project of iaspm US, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the Pop Conference, which is now hosted by the Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music. I'm Carl Wilson, one of the series organizers, along with Eric Weisbart and Kimberly Mack. You can find our whole calendar on the iaspm website under the Journal of Popular Music Studies tab. And you can also catch up on videos of all of our past sessions on Eric Weisbart's channel on YouTube, including last week's with Norma Coates and Sarah Gulgas on early rock television and 60s Baroque rock, respectively. I'll mention again that we've decided to bring the series back for the fall season. So if you or anybody you know has a book coming up then, or one that you'll be deep in progress on, then watch out for the call for proposals in early July. Next week, Tuesday, June 29th, we're happy to say we're finally bringing you the session we had to cancel because of the electrical grid crisis in Texas back in February. The special topic will be cultural history and practice around instruments with the power trio of Matt Brennan on drums, Brian F. Wright on the bass, and Sue Foley on guitar. But today, it's time to talk David Bowie in sound and vision with Landon Palmer and Katherine Reed. So let me quickly introduce our presenters. Landon Palmer is an assistant professor in the Department of Journalism and Creative Media at the University of Alabama. He's a film and media historian who studies the functions of stardom and popular music. His book, Rockstar Movie Star, Power and Performance in Cinematic Rock Stardom, which along with Bowie talks about Elvis, the Beatles, Madonna, and more, came out in September from Oxford University Press. And I'll post a link with a discount code in the chat for those who want to get a copy. And Katherine Reed is an associate professor of musicology at California State University, Fullerton. Her research interests include musical semiotics, the use of pre-existing music in film, and British popular music, particularly David Bowie's works of the 1970s. She's the co-editor of the collection Music in Twin Peaks, Listen to the Sounds from Routledge, and is at work on her current book project for Bloomsbury, Hooked to the Silver Screen, David Bowie and the Moving Image. As always, during their conversation, please put your questions for the Q&A in the chat sidebar. And after they're finished their conversation, Kim will use them to call on you to unmute and raise them in the Q&A. And of course, you can also use the chat for comments and conversation. The presenters will get a copy of the chat transcript after the session for their own reference, and it's often a really valuable resource for them. So now, Landon and Katie, please get this fantastic voyage underway.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our organizers, Carl, Eric, and Kim. It's really exciting to be a part of this wonderful lineup. And special thanks to Landon for suggesting this joint talk today. It's such a pleasure to get to talk about this project and Bowie and to get to be in conversation with you, Landon. Your work is fascinating and so related to what I'm doing. So I'm really looking forward to this. Let me go ahead and share my screen and get started. So as Carl mentioned, I'm going to be speaking about my current book project, Hooked to the Silver Screen, David Bowie and the Moving Image. And this project deals with all of the ways that Bowie used the moving image throughout his career. I'm pretty deep in process in writing it right now, so I won't be giving you an overview of each and every single chapter, but I figured I'd give you a bird's eye view of the book and delve a little more deeply into one section of it before passing the baton to Landon to talk a little bit about Bowie in relation to his project. But I thought I would start with a moment that set me on my journey thinking about this particular topic. And that is a clip from Todd Haynes' 1998 film, Velvet Goldmine. Velvet Goldmine tells the story of a 1970s rock star who is definitely not David Bowie, but who has an alien bisexual rock god persona and who in many ways is David Bowie. It's a film that I love a lot, but that not every Bowie fan does. And I thought I would show you a portion of the film that shows you why it's interesting to me and why it's divisive for some. So here we go. Boys from quadrant 44 with that vicious metal hounds don't come round here no more. Sometimes I wonder if I'm still alive. Oh, 6 feet down at age 25. for time, I'll stop it there. If you're a Bowie fan, there's a lot to love because there's a lot that's familiar, right? The song that Craig Wedren has written here is an amalgam of a lot of great glam rock musical ideas. Lyrically, it's an amalgam of a lot of lyrical ideas that Bowie plays with too. But visually, of course, there's a lot of references to much of Bowie's career and the way he presented himself. So for some fans, it feels a little bit like a cheap ripoff. It's Bowie, but not quite good enough to be Bowie. But for me, it was interesting because what I see Haynes doing is a lot of what I see Bowie doing too. He is referencing directly some pretty iconic moments in Bowie music videos, as in the Life on Mars video. And for eagle-eyed viewers, we might have even seen the bejeweled serpent-like guy on the floor in that video who looks a lot like Bowie mentor Lindsay Kemp, here seen in the music video for John, I'm Only Dancing. So there are a lot of really direct references that are happening here. And what I see Haynes doing is taking iconic moments from Bowie's videography and reusing them in interesting ways, building meaning upon meaning, which is in many ways what Bowie saw himself doing. We could go back to the sort of legendary quote of Bowie as human photostat machine, borrowing bits and pieces from iconic popular culture in order to create something which is uniquely his own. That's something that I see as informing much of Bowie's use of the moving image, which is central to his work from the beginning of his career. And it's one of the reasons why I love Velvet Goldmine, because I think that it's following in Bowie's mode of operation, if not following directly in his style. So in my project, I wanted to follow that thread, to think about how this sort of semiotic play permeates all sorts of different uses of the moving image in Bowie's work. And to do so by drawing together lots of those different areas across his career, rather than focusing on just one. There's been tons of great work about Bowie and his creation of persona. We could think of Phil Auslander's work there. Lots of great work on his creation of worlds within his albums. Glenn Hendler's own exploration of Diamond Dogs is a wonderful example of this. And we can look to Sheldon Waldrop's work as well for lots of examples of this. Studies of his music video, Lisa Perot and others have gone into great depth in. But what I wanted to do with this project is sort of tie all of those points across Bowie's long career together to see how they hang together and what common threads we can tease out among them. So, sorry. There we go. So that is the basis for my book project, thinking about Bowie's semiotic play with music and the moving image, both from the angle of Bowie as auteur and from Bowie as audiovisual sign. So those are the main dividing line for my book, the two main sections in which my study takes place. What I mean by Bowie as auteur is Bowie as creator of an audiovisual language and an audiovisual style. So in that section of my book, I take a look at how we can see a sort of semiotics of Bowie developing throughout his career. The first example that I take a look at is his Love You Till Tuesday promotional video from the late 1960s, where we start to see some of these ideas develop. From there, in my next chapter, I take a look at his music videos, following the thread of Bowie presenting himself as object in some of his music videos. So I look first at the Mick Rock directed Life on Mars from 1973. Second, I look at 1980s Ashes to Ashes, which Bowie co-directed with David Mallet. And lastly, I take a look at 2013's Where Are We Now, the video from the Next Day album that's directed by video artist Tony Orsler, where Bowie is actually turned into a literal object. He is one of Orsler's electric effigies in that video, a doll with a projected face on it. From there, I take a look at perhaps the most literal incarnation of Bowie as auteur, the films that he planned to make. And if you're thinking Bowie was never a director of a feature film, you're correct, but he did plan a few of them and talked at length about many of them in interviews. So the center of this chapter is his planned Diamond Dogs film, for which we have a tiny bit of footage, which I'll be showing you in a second, and a lot of planning papers. Although I also make reference to his Major Tom film that he plans around the time of the Young Americans album. It's the Major Tom character coming back to Earth, and a few other projects. So that's actually the section I'll be delving a little bit deeper into in a second here. And then the second half of my book deals with Bowie as audiovisual sign, or the way in which others have taken the complex star image that Bowie has built in his own audiovisual works and used it in different ways. So one chapter looks at his acting appearances, which Landon will delve into much deeper a little bit later. And the next chapter deals with his appearances in advertising. So this was the sample that was distributed before our talk, looking at the way that different brands have used Bowie as sign in kind of complicated and complex ways throughout his career. And then the last part, last main chapter of the book deals with depictions of Bowie in film. So Velvet Goldmine forms the main meat of this chapter, but I also look at the Bowie episode of Flight of the Conchords and at 2020's Stardust, which deals with Bowie's first tour of America and is interesting in its own ways. So covering a lot of ground there, but for today, I'm just going to dip our toes into the planned film section. So as promised, this chapter deals with the film that Bowie had planned around his 1974 album, Diamond Dogs. We have a little bit of planning footage from this that Bowie himself shot, reportedly in the Pierre Hotel in New York in 1974. To give you a very brief background, Diamond Dogs, the album, takes some inspiration from George Orwell's 1984, a novel that Bowie had originally hoped to adapt into a stage musical. Orwell's estate, and specifically Orwell's widow, denied the rights for that, so that never happened. But if you have heard the album, you know that 1984 lives on in Diamond Dogs, specifically with 1984 and Big Brother and some other resonances there. As the Diamond Dogs project continued to develop, we see the pretty elaborate tour that Bowie and company plan in support of the album. This has a set designed by Mark Ravitz and production designed by Jules Fisher, a legendary Broadway production designer who you may have heard mention of in Steve Waxman's talk earlier in this series when he mentioned Jules Fisher's work with the Rolling Stones on their 1975 tour of the Americas. So some of the bits and pieces from this complex Diamond Dogs project end up in that touring show. And some of the visual language from that touring show also ends up in this planned film project. So I'm going to show you some of the footage that Bowie shot and then talk to you a little bit about what we see there and how we can study a film that never really came to be.
That's the north. This is the beginning of the film called Diamond Dogs. I put north because I didn't know what year it says.
So here we can see Bowie writing out what would be some opening credits. We see that he's cast several of his collaborators in this film, including Serinda Fox, who shows up in the Jean Genie video, Lindsay Kemp, who we already mentioned, and Bowie casts himself as the character Harpy here. We also see that he's got the beginnings of some production design ideas happening. We can see a sort of dilapidated dystopian cityscape in some of the miniatures that he's built. What's interesting is that we can also see him using some in-camera effects to create the beginnings of a film here. He's got some painted backdrops like what you'll see right here, and you can see a miniature Bowie moving inside it. This is using a technique that we might see in early film, the shifting process that's used in things like Fritz Lang's Metropolis, among others. So in-camera effects to allow him to use his own stone drawn and painted backdrops to create the beginnings of a film world here. And in order to piece together what that film world would have looked like, I've been able to use some archival evidence beyond that video footage. So Bowie himself kept and preserved many of the objects from his long career in the privately held David Bowie archive, parts of which the world got to see in the David Bowie Is exhibition that was organized in concert with the Victoria and Albert Museum. So some of the planning documents from the film and from the 74 tour were displayed there, and I've been able to make use of that. I've also been able to interview Mark Ravitz, who you see here, who designed the set for the 74 tour, as well as Jules Fisher, production designer for that tour. And they were able to speak a bit about some of the influences that Bowie specifically mentioned and some of the narrative ideas that he brought to the stage show that we can then maybe assume might transfer into the film itself. The final archival piece that was really important to this work was the Jules Fisher papers that are held at the Rock Hall. Big thanks to Jenny Thomas and the other archivists and librarians there for their help with these wonderful planning documents. They've got budgets and sketches and some recordings of pre-concert tapes that were played for the 74 tour. So lots of just wonderful material in piecing together what Bowie had in mind for this Diamond Dogs project. And in terms of a musical narrative that we can see within the stage show and that we might see transferring into a planned film, there are some moments that are narratively important on the album and definitely narratively important in the way that they're brought to the stage too. We might think, for example, of the Sweet Thing Candidate Suite being performed on the movable catwalk bridge in the center of the stage set with this really dramatic lighting and a costume change in the middle of it. We could also think of Bowie singing Big Brother atop the mirrored egg that moves around the stage as part of the stage show. And lastly, we might also consider the title track, Diamond Dogs, sung as Bowie is tied up by his dogs, his backup dancers and singers during this first leg of the show. So there are really rich visual moments that show up in the touring show and that we might expect to be echoed in some of the elements that could have come to film. We might also expect that this visual language we see in the set would also show up. As I mentioned, the catwalk in the center is movable. It went up and down and used Porsche brakes apparently to get that mechanism to work. The mirrored egg rolled out and opened up. Bowie would sing the song Time from a hand within the egg. And some of the buildings were actually paper that would be torn down in the apocalyptic ending of the show. So there's this destruction of the cityscape that happens as well. If this looks visually evocative of something, you could perhaps be thinking about Metropolis, or maybe even the artwork of Georg Grosch and others from the Weimar era. In their planning meetings, Mark Ravitz talks about how Bowie comes to him with 3 inspiration words: Nuremberg, Metropolis, and power. And we can definitely see a lot of that echoed in the visual language of what's happening here. Bowie isn't hiding these influences, right? They're very, very obvious. And I would say obvious because we're supposed to be able to put these pieces together and to be able to understand the polysemic work that he's building here. And we can see some of that in his sketches and his planning documents too. These documents run the gamut from things that are pulled out of a notebook, like this marker drawing, to things that are much more formal, like the storyboards that you can see on the right. I've not seen all of the storyboards that the David Bowie Archive holds, but it would appear that there's at least 40 cells there, giving the appearance that he had storyboarded out a fair amount of the film itself. And those storyboards are particularly interesting because they give us an idea not only of what he intended to show, but how he intended to show it. Each cell has a little description underneath it, some of which talk about camera movement, some of which show us how he intends to frame each of these elements. And there we can also see the influence, particularly of German Expressionist film. We know from some Bowie histories that he had seen many of these films at repertory theaters in the 1970s. So he's super familiar with our Fritz Lang, with our Robert Wiener, with all of these guys. And that shows up in the visual language that he's planning here, which again, we can see in more of these planning documents. This marker scene sketch on the left-hand side is, to me, again, super evocative of what Grosch is doing with the sort of urban decay of Weimar Germany here. And we can see in these storyboard cells that I've isolated on the right-hand side, some of the ways in which Bowie is using graphic lines in backdrops and lighting and framing in order to evoke, for example, the cabinet of Dr. Caligari in super direct ways. So these planning documents allow us to make a lot of connections between what Bowie, the photostat machine, is taking up and how he might be putting it out, right? And that allows us to make connections between this planned but never realized work and many of the other works that Bowie did give us in the form of music videos and things like that. So in order to piece this together, again, I've been looking through archival materials from the Diamond Dogs era through the 2000s, where we see some of these film planning ideas. Again, there's the Diamond Dogs project. There's also a Young Americans project that seems not as well planned out, not as well storyboarded, but he's written some sort of synopsis scenario ideas for this one and a few rougher drawings. He does mention these projects in interviews from about 1973 to at least the early 2000s, and he hints at a lot of others. He hints that he has some sort of audiovisual plan for the Ziggy Stardust material, which sadly never comes to fruition, and lots of other things. We always have to take Bowie interviews with a grain of salt, but he does keep coming back to this idea of directing a film. And when he is at sort of the height of his film stardom in the mid-1980s, as Landon's going to discuss, in tons of interviews, he keeps saying, this is all great, but I'm learning so much that I want to take with me when I step behind the camera. And what's really interesting about these works is the ways that we can clearly map all of the connections between Bowie's different influences, between his own musical works and his clear cinephilia, and between those musical works and the literature he's interested in, whether that is Orwell or Ballard or Burroughs or any of the other people he's drawing into conversation here, and between these works and his acting work as well. There's a careful crafting of a shared encyclopedia with his audience that allows him to do some pretty interesting semiotic things, to build meaning upon meaning and to change the way we approach some certain cultural objects. And I would say we can also see in these planned film projects part of his sort of rock star image as a creative provocateur. He's interested in engaging with the ways that he can be seen as a copier, as a reuser. And that's absolutely present within many of these planned but not realized film projects as well. So with that, I will hand it over to our next presenter, Landon Palmer, to talk a little bit more about Bowie's appearances on screen, the ones that actually happened, and how we can think about that in relation to Bowie's star image.
Thank you, Katie. That was great. And thanks again for agreeing to be part of this. Since seeing some of the archival research that you've been doing at last year's Music and the Moving Image Conference, I've been really interested in looking forward to this project. So I'm really looking forward to the book. And I'll echo what Katie said in thanking Carl and Kimberly and Eric as well, in terms of keeping this going. I really enjoyed attending these book talks. So as Kay said, I will be talking a little bit about Bowie's varied forms of moving image work in other people's films that I focus on in a chapter of my book. I'm going to set up my screen share real quick. All right, everybody see that? Okay, so where Katie's book looks at Bowie's various modes of moving image work from as they extend from his musical and stage work, my book looks at Bowie as one of several case studies of rock stars engaged in feature film performance. So my book, Rock Star, Movie Star, Power and Performance in Cinematic Rock Stardom, which came out from Oxford University Press in September, examines rock star performances in motion pictures beyond certain questions of quality and authenticity and autonomy that have often dominated discourse around such performances. Instead, I ask, what purposes have rock stars served for movies, and to what purposes have movies served for rock stars? So I approach rock stars in this way as prominent workers within the motion picture industry who first migrated into motion pictures at a critical time in Hollywood history when movies seemed to be losing cultural prominence in the face of television and new forms of consumer leisure. Each chapter examines either a certain rock star or cycle of rock themed films that emphasize rock star performance, and how each of these case studies facilitates certain transitions in film industry practice. So, for example, the role of Elvis movies in the growing market for soundtrack LPs, or Madonna's film career when MTV was a major promotional platform for motion pictures in the late 80s and early 90s. So even though Bowie constitutes just one chapter in this study, he was the inspiration for the entire project when I began working on it as a dissertation, particularly The Man Who Fell to Earth, just kind of trying to solve the enigma of that film in so many ways. Because his film performances seem to resist the kind of clear industrial emplacement that's readily evident in the case of, say, Elvis. His screen presence seems to trouble the prominent instrumentalization of famous musicians in motion pictures towards the goal of profit. Bowie's compelling status as a limit case for the commercial practice of casting rock stars in movies is why I put him on the cover. And that's why I opened the book with an anecdote about Christopher Nolan's reasoning behind casting Bowie as Nikola Tesla in The Prestige, one of his last on-screen roles, where the director wanted the role to be played by an actor with a mysterious and magnetic charisma who draws attention within only 10 minutes of screen time. And so that meant, for Nolan, that meant casting a rock star rather than a traditional film actor who could carry into the film this whole reserve of meaning and this whole persona from outside of the film. And Nolan himself in interviews has been very explicit about his purposes regarding that. And so that example to me points to how casting rock stars in films has taken on and can take on various functions beyond leading or musical roles. So indeed, when Bowie has been discussed in terms of his film performances, cultural critics and scholars have very understandably often focused on his physicality, the visual aspects of his performances, and the importance of style in his embodiment of characters, because there's a rich trove of things to analyze there. And it's, it's clear how this reading fits within Bowie's music persona and biography as a rock musician who became famous through the glam period, who was never interested in 60s ideas about rock authenticity, who authored characters and narratives through albums and tours, and even as someone formerly trained in the art of mime, which he employed directly in the film Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, that you can see here at the bottom. And certain intersections between Bowie's film work and the visual aspects of his musical work support this reading. And I'm excited that that Katie is doing kind of a very rigorous archival research in this respect. So, but as an example of this, although none of the music that he attempted to compose for the film showed up in the film The Man Who Fell to Earth, stills from this film were used as the album covers for Station to Station and Low. So Bowie's visual interest in music seemed to be augmented by his moving image persona, bolstering his reputation as an autonomous, adaptable performer working across multiple creative modes. So on the one hand, Bowie's film career can be read as an extension of his interest in performance persona and visuality that were already prominent in his music career. But on the other hand, and this is where I get into my argument, if Bowie's film career seems distinctive, it's because he began starring in films during a key transitional period in film and in film music that pushed English language feature filmmaking beyond historically conventional uses of sound in music. So looking beyond Bowie's self-authorship and considering the fact that these were collaborative works, I look at the industrial context in which he worked, specifically in the 70s and 80s. And that to me makes a seemingly esoteric moving image career much more legible. The reasons why Bowie's film career was different from, say, Elvis Presley's has to do with the decisive casting, musical, and visual strategies adopted by certain filmmakers and certain historical conventions and marketing practices pertaining to film music. In order to place Bowie's mutability as a performer within the larger industrial context in which he worked, I focus in my Bowie case study on 5 starring film roles between 1976 and 1986. That is Man Who Fell to Earth, The Hunger, Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, Absolute Beginners, and Labyrinth. And I explore how, even though Bowie is not cast in musical roles for these first 3 films, the place of his performances within these films, uses of music, gives insight into larger filmmaking practices by which these movies were made. Practices that opened up new means for connecting sounds and images in narrative filmmaking. I focus on 2 particular musical practices in filmmaking during this time period that bring context to Bowie's film roles. First, what scholars call compilation or composite scoring in the 1960s and 1970s. As made famous in examples such as Simon Garfunkel's Sounds of Silence and The Graduate, this practice standardized the use of popular song in commercial feature filmmaking, which opened up space for filmmakers to develop new combinations of sounds and images in which the former was no longer subordinate to the latter. But this type of scoring also meant that popular musicians, particularly rock musicians, since whose careers in film began in the 50s, no longer needed to actually perform music on screen in order for films to adopt those types of popular music. So this helps to explain a film like The Man Who Fell to Earth, Bowie's feature film role in which he was cast in a leading role as a humanoid alien who poses as a billionaire inventor as he seeks a solution for his home planet's water shortage. Now, it would seem that even though Man Who Fell to Earth was made after the Ziggy Stardust period, that this seems like a pretty direct translation of his supernatural persona. But in fact, Nicholas Roeg was interested in Bowie based upon in casting Bowie based upon his appearance in Cracked Actor, a documentary about him wrestling with the Ziggy Stardust persona. And in fact, Roeg made a career out of casting non-traditional actors in leading roles, such as Mick Jagger in Performance and Art Garfunkel in Bad Timing. And for The Man Who Fell to Earth, he initially even considered Michael Crichton to be cast in the leading title role. So casting Bowie in this non-musical role in a film that employs an eclectic combination of different kinds of music, from Roy Orbison to the compositions of Stomu Yamashita to John Phillips's original score, which consists of adopting many genres from bluegrass to jazz, illustrates the emergent possibilities between music, musician, and film brought about by these practices. The following scene that I'm going to show, for example, finds Bowie's character, Thomas Jerome Newton, using a compilation of music via media playback technologies to indulge in his alienation and depression on planet Earth, and demonstrates how films of this period could bring together a composite of popular culture texts, amongst which I would include Bowie himself.
Came in, it's not your color, it's blue.
No.
It's exactly the same style.
No.
Damn it!
No, I don't like it.
All right, well, I'll send it back. I've had enough.
I don't want to talk to anyone.
Tommy, what's happened to you?
What's happened to me? What is this music Francois keeps singing? I don't like it.
Some giant composer?
I like to hear people sing. Let's have singing. Find some singing.
We'll sing.
I feel so bad, I've got a worried mind.
Let's talk.
I'm so lonesome all the time.
Oh, don't turn on those damn TVs. Come on, Tommy. Talk to me. I can't stand what's happening to you, whatever it is. Why didn't you just tell me? I hate you. I don't.
Therefore, the court sentences the aforementioned William Budd, Paul Topman, Royal Navy, to die by hanging on the first watch of the day following these proceedings.
All right, here we go.
Signed, Philip Seymour, senior member. We will begin by...
I'm off.
Anything to say? If you have nothing to say, the sentence of the court will be carried out.
Modify our body and our engine and...
All right, I'll stop that montage there. I wanted to make sure to get to the point where an Elvis movie is amongst the many different texts that he's watching here. So the second musical practice that gives context for Bowie's film work is synergy, the industrial buzzword employed throughout the 1980s that was used in the commercial film and popular music businesses to describe, in particular, MTV's role as a platform for cross-promoting films and soundtrack albums. At the height of his mainstream popularity in the early to mid-1980s, Bowie decisively attempted to separate his acting career from his music career, as is evident in two 1983 films in which, as with The Man Who Fell to Earth, he performs adjacent to the film's music. The sleek vampire thriller The Hunger and the transnational art film and prisoner of war drama Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. However, by 1986, Bowie, in his final leading film roles, directly embraced synergy by performing as both star musician and star actor in Absolute, Beginners, and Labyrinth. Regardless of whether Bowie sings, however, all four of these films, despite their different national contexts, employ the visual and/or promotional language of MTV-era synergy. And for the sake of time, I'll just give one example. The Hunger was the first feature film directed by Tony Scott, who is part of a generation of British commercial directors who helped popularize a distinctive visual style in television advertising that extended into music videos and feature films. These directors helped standardize what Justin Wyatt calls the high concept style, or what has been colloquially termed the MTV style, a visual style that emphasized atmosphere, quick pacing, and fashion in a way that rejected Hollywood's goal-oriented storytelling, but was conducive to cross-media promotion and the dominant visual language of advertising. Despite the fact that Bowie was at the height of his mainstream fame in 1983 with the release of Let's Dance, his contribution to this film's use of the high concept style is distinctly visual, with Scott adopting Bowie's reputation as a fashion icon and performer of otherworldly figures. Yet Bowie is again placed within notable musical moments that speak to larger determinative film practices in which he's working. The high concept style is on full display in the, I think it's safe to say, famous opening of The Hunger, where Bowie's character looks for prey alongside Catherine Deneuve while attending a performance by Bauhaus. And there's this interesting visual interplay between Peter Murphy and David Bowie right at the outside of the clip here, in which it looks like it's edited together to make it look like there's kind of that look like there's eye contact, but the kind of spatial sense of the club in which they exist is, it's not exactly clear. So I'm going to actually fast forward here to 1 minute and 25 seconds for the sake of time. All right, I'll end with the waving hello. So just to bring this to a close, even when Bowie is not singing on screen, in his starring feature film roles, he has been regularly emplaced within musical moments that speak to the larger convergences between film and popular music that characterize the years in which he was a leading man. Although Bowie's status as a musician is carefully distanced in the making and promotion of many such films, his work in motion pictures directly engaged in the cinematic language of popular music. Okay, so with that being said, we'll stop here. And Katie and I will talk for a bit, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. So Katie, I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about your methodology in your archival work. I know that the David Bowie estate itself is very selective in terms of putting out information in for example, museum exhibits, but is not a place that scholars can kind of look for an uncurated archive of David Bowie. But looking at other places like the Rock Hall, that seems to be an interesting way to work around that. But you're also talking about live performances, which are so ephemeral, and films that are unmade, and so there are significant gaps that you have to mine. So I'm just curious to hear you talk a little bit more about your methods, what your thinking is in regards to that, in looking at some of these materials.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks so much for your awesome presentation. I can't wait to get into delving into some of that. As far as the archival stuff, you are correct that it has been both wonderful and terrible that Bowie maintained his own archive. Wonderful in that all of this stuff has been maintained and has been maintained in museum quality archival spaces. So we have all of this ephemera. We have his notes on pieces of notebook paper. We have costumes from all of his various eras, but we can't access any of it. I have been bugging Bowie's personal archivist for years, who keeps saying that the estate has plans for things and that we are not currently open to researchers, which I totally understand. And we can see some of the slow rollout that's happening, right? If you're a Bowie completionist, you've probably bought a lot of the era-specific box sets that feature outtakes and images from various eras. They do clearly have a plan for releasing commercially some of this stuff, but it's still my fervent hope that they may eventually find a more public home for this archive, which is just invaluable and would be so exciting to be able to get our hands on. So in terms of dealing with materials from the David Bowie archive itself, I have had what I was able to see when the David Bowie exhibit was in Chicago and when it was in Brooklyn. The illicit photos that other people, certainly not myself, took during those exhibit stops. And the augmented reality app that the estate released in, I want to say 2019, which if anyone is interested in this and hasn't yet shelled out the $5 or whatever it is for the app, it's actually worth it. There are some things that weren't shown at every stop of the David Bowie's exhibit, and you can look at them in much more detail. So that's been something that's actually allowed me to see a little bit more of the Diamond Dogs planning material, since there is an entire section of the app that is specific to the Diamond Dogs project. So that's been a really rich resource. In terms of other archival sources, The Rock Hall has been just fantastic, and the papers that they have from Jules Fisher have been really illuminating. It shows the sort of business side of this project and the things that were planned but may not have been feasible to bring to life just yet. There are planning documents about Bowie wanting to have both video and film projection in the 74 tour. Of course, live video editing in 1974 would have been just astronomically expensive. And you can see that in the budgets. It gets written in and then crossed out because it would have cost more than the entire lighting budget for the tour. So it's fantastic to be able to see the sort of stages of development that are illuminated by those budgets. In terms of the live performance thing, I didn't talk about this during my presentation, but the 74 tour is so tantalizing because we have bits and pieces of video from it, but no officially released full-length video or film, sadly. Although again, this is another thing that is rumored to exist within the archive, but not yet have been released. So there are lots of bootlegs of little bits and pieces of the tour, which have been interesting. Of course, I would never pay for such illegal things, but they're findable on the internet. And it's possible to do that kind of research through some of those back channels. But there have been challenges specific to the Diamond Dogs era because of the sort of technological moment in which it happens. 1974, what we get is fan shot like Super 8 footage because nobody's bringing a Sony Portapack into like a 1974 show, right? So we have those little bits and pieces that we're able to look at, and piecing together what we can from that has been really interesting. Landon, I also wondered about archival and sort of ephemeral stuff that you dealt with in terms of stuff on the production side and also stuff on the publicity side for each of the films that you were looking at. Could you talk a little bit about some of the materials that you brought into your study there?
Yeah, so with my first several chapters on Elvis movies, Beatles movies, and then on concert documentaries in 1969, I was able to find through various archives, some primary documentation, production notes, contracts, early script drafts that lended a lot of kind of specificity to the industrial conditions in which these films were made. I did not have similar access in regards to Bowie's film work. And so beyond going to David Bowie is in Chicago as well, and seeing some of those, some of those storyboards for Hunger City for the first time, I have really been reliant on public narratives, including interviews, DVD commentaries, newspaper articles from the time and things like that. And that's something that what I certainly had to be critical and mindful of, especially given, as you had mentioned earlier, David Bowie is not a reliable source himself in terms of interviews. But what I thought was the most interesting were some of the contradictions that he made in terms of how he discussed these film productions and his involvement with them and his goals in acting in other people's films. Namely, for example, the fact that his quote unquote unused score for A Man Who Fell to Earth, at times he has basically said this side 2 for Low is that score. Other times he has really played that down and said that there's kind of more of a vague kind of record of musical inspiration. But also in terms of film acting, in 1983, when he was doing publicity for Let's Dance and when he was doing publicity for Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, he talked about how he didn't want to be a musical performer in films and how he deliberately wanted to avoid that. He kind of thought I think during one of the Cannes press conferences for Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, he said something along the lines of, what was the exact wording? Where like, oh, if you don't like the acting, maybe you'll like the music. That he wanted to kind of avoid that type of performance. And then yet in 1986, when he's promoting Labyrinth, he says, "I've always wanted to help write music for a film that I performed in." And a direct contradiction, but in any case, that I think really kind of plays into the sense of self-authorship, no matter what he's doing, and no matter even if he's kind of directly contradicting his previously stated aspirations. Of course, he did that in many aspects of his music persona, but also in that respect, sometimes his actual film roles would contradict things that he was saying contemporaneously about his music persona. For example, the infamous Rolling Stone interview in 1983, where David Bowie says, "I'm straight." And, his film, as I saw somebody in the chat said that The Hunger is an appropriate film clip to show during Pride Month. And, his film roles during that year, both The Hunger and A Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, were in film roles that really seemed to be much more built off of his queer persona from the 1970s than this new kind of conservative persona in the early 1980s that he was trying to put forth. One question I had, I'm wondering kind of the timeline that you've been working on Bowie stuff, and if his death in 2016, for example, has kind of affected how it is that you are looking at some of this information, especially in terms of thinking about his last music videos and his last albums, and as somebody whose career was very decisively kind of putting a version of themselves out there, that how calculated those last years were in that respect.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this has been a project that I've been working on in bits and pieces for a long time, probably going back to my PhD work. I don't think that I had fully formulated it as a unified project until after Bowie's passing. But you're absolutely right that retroactively we can look at a lot of his late works in a different light. I think particularly about something like Lazarus, the stage musical that he builds around the character of Thomas Jerome Newton, and around many of his earlier works from a lot of different eras in his career, as being a really interesting moment that goes back to that idea of Bowie as auteur. We see him as directing a production for the stage, which is also something he says over and over again he wants to do, and bringing in elements of the moving image, both through the direct reference to probably his most famous screen role and through his use of the moving image on stage during that production. We can see it as sort of a culmination of a lot of the themes he's interested in throughout his career. We've got doubles, we've got death, we've got the idea of the actor and playing a role that's really important throughout Lazarus. And so, yes, his passing absolutely changed the way that I thought about that work, and that I think about those final years as well. I actually wondered if you had any thoughts about Lazarus, given its connection to Man Who Fell to Earth. Have you seen it yet?
I have not, no.
Okay.
I was desperate to see it when it came out, but it was a long trip from Indiana where I was doing my PhD.
Fair enough. I didn't get to see it live either. I only saw it when they streamed it on his birthday earlier this year. So It is still fresh in my mind because of that.
Yeah.
To go back to some of the works that you were discussing, I wondered if you had any thoughts about, speaking of synergy, the music videos that are released in support of Absolute Beginners and Labyrinth. So like the Underground video that Bowie later complains about because he didn't have control over it. I wondered if you had any thoughts about that. I'll just open that up.
Yeah. I think that they're really important paratexts for understanding what those films are doing, and the role of his persona in making meanings in these films, and Bowie just as kind of an economic entity that is being used to straddle media industries in this respect. All those music videos are very interesting. The one for the number they sing, I'm forgetting the name off the top of my head, but that's something. I'm forgetting what it's called. But it's this big number where it looks kind of like a mid-century Hollywood music number. Yes, thank you, Glenn. That's Motivation.
Oh, Absolute Beginners. I was like, I can't think of one from Labyrinth, but yes.
Oh, I'm sorry if I misspoke.
Oh no, you didn't say which film. I just.
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, that's motivation. Where the music video is just simply the song number kind of excerpted from the film and put onto MTV. Whereas the music video for Absolute Beginners is a more kind of characteristic of promoting films on mid 1980s MTV, where you have some footage shot specifically for the music video interspersed with these scenes from the film. And so I thought that was an interesting way of kind of demonstrating how Absolute Beginners is a film that is trying to do so many things in terms of meshing together kind of like 1980s and mid-century popular culture, and in making a musical that does both, and then making music videos that do both. And then similarly with the Underground music video, that one very brief moment where the video goes through like the litany of Bowie's past screen personae, I think is so characteristic of that particular period, where he's kind of has this quote unquote straight image, and straight both in terms of sexuality, but also in terms of like, this is Bowie without all the bells and whistles. This is a straightforward Bowie. I mean, obviously that's a performance too, but there are numerous things that he's doing in that period of his career that's kind of presenting the straightforward Bowie, that kind of looks at his past work as this kind of repository of characters that led up to this moment. Not to go too long on this, I think the most interesting music video of a film associated with his, the most interesting music video of a film associated with Bowie during this period is the one for Forbidden Colors, the David Sylvain's take on the musical theme by Ryuichi Sakamoto from Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. It does that typical MTV in the 80s thing of having music video footage interspersed with film footage, and none of the film footage features a shot of David Bowie from the film. And that seemed to me to be part of this deliberate distancing of Bowie from the production and role of music in that film, to not confuse this David Sylvain and Ryuichi Sakamoto song as a David Bowie music video, while also kind of participating in this language of synergy. So I see that we're almost at the end of the hour here. Should we switch to Q&A?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. All right, so let's start with Antonia. Antonia, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you for this really rich presentation. I asked a question that's, I don't know, kind of basic, but I was thinking about what was Bowie's aspiration in the Diamond Dog movies. And I compared it to something like The Wall by Pink Floyd or something. Was he trying to be competing with the filmmakers of the day? What was his aspiration?
That's a great question. And I don't have a direct Bowie interview answer I can point to, but my instinct would be that he would like to be in conversation with the auteurs of the day. In lots of his interviews from this time period, he name checks all of the various directors he sees as important and influential for him. We hear about Kubrick and A Clockwork Orange quite frequently. And that would be my guess in terms of like the milieu in which he would like to be seen. That's the understanding I have from what shows up during that time period. But it is really interesting because, as you say, we get these other movies that are built around albums or movies that are built around performances from the time period. And it would be easy to see it as more closely related to that. But I think Bowie had different ambitions there in terms of the project that he was undertaking. Great question.
Right. Glenn.
I totally agree with your answer to that question. I think he wanted to be in conversation with the German expressionists too. I mean, he really he was out of time in a strange way. But that's not my question. I wanted to try and come up with a question that was kind of for both of you, and I'm going to ask something about the contrast between your two different projects, right? Because one is, at least what we heard, like one is about Bowie as the director of films that were never made. And I gotta say, I'm so like envious that you managed to piece that together. I really wanted to, and I couldn't figure out how. And you said something about it. It's really good, really interesting. And then Bowie is a presence in these films by other people, where he had to subordinate his. I mean, his image is still there, but he had to subordinate himself to the directors. There's all that discourse you talked about, Lennon, in the book about his professionalism, and how, which is a kind of an auteur thing to do. It's so weird for someone who is such a control freak and such an auteur of his image in general, for him to be able to do that. So how do you talk about that in a way with each other, and the contrast between those two things?
I think that's a fascinating question, and it gets at one of the sort of central tensions that I think Landon and I both deal with, this idea of someone who has such a carefully constructed star image that he himself is really integrally involved in the crafting of, to then cede that control. Although that idea of Bowie as actor is really central to Bowie too. We see him crediting himself as the actor on Hunky Dory. We see him acting in films from the late 1960s. We could think of The Image onward, right? So I don't have a good answer other than that it is an interesting and provocative tension that we see in the case of Bowie in particular, but also in the other case studies that Landon's looking at. Did you have anything you want to say there?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, and I think that even when he is cast in other people's films, there is still kind of a performance of authorship that's going on. And I feel like that has really taken a hold discursively, especially after he died. When I was reading assessments in popular print from like Time and places like that, where people have kind of talked about quite fluidly his movie stardom as kind of as an extension of his musical work, and so I think that it seems to me that he was, I do wish that I knew a little bit more behind this, of what happened behind the scenes of these films, beyond what it is that filmmakers and screenwriters and others have talked about publicly, but it does seem like he is interested even in these collaborative contexts of giving an impression of authorial control of himself, at least, but without doing so in a way that made him seem like a disruptive film worker. And so that's where I think, in terms of what you mentioned from my book, where this reputation of professionalism plays in, that even though he is this rock star whose star image was at one point predicated on shock, that he is this very professional kind of above the line laborer within this very expensive multimedia context. Thank you for that question.
It's interesting because that idea of a great collaborator also comes up in like everything that Mick Rock says about the music videos that they made together. He says, Bowie didn't change a single frame. It was all this collaboration that we got to have together. And man, I don't know how much I believe that Bowie didn't change a single frame, but it's interesting that discourse goes into his music video work as well, and even a little bit further back than some of his lead acting roles in feature films.
Some of his fellow, sorry to follow up, but some of his fellow musicians would say that about him in the studio too, that he would set a scene and then let them do their thing. So there's a balance there. That's interesting.
Totally.
Great. Okay, Alex, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. First off, great talk. I'm looking forward to reading your book, Katherine, and
Oh no.
Oh no, okay. Alex is frozen. So why don't we go ahead and move forward? We'll come back to Alex. John, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, both fantastic presentations. I enjoyed that so much. And I'll just say, Glenn, I really enjoyed your book on Diamond Dogs as well. I was just wondering if either of you might be interested in relating your ideas about Bowie's representations in film to contemporary artists. And I'm thinking particularly of Beyonce and Grimes, as two artists who we can quite easily think of as auteurs who have directed their own films or videos and worked quite seamlessly across performance, sound, image.
Absolutely. And Landon actually discusses a bit of Beyonce and some Janelle Monáe in the coda to his book. So maybe I'll let him go first here.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Yeah, I think this is a really kind of interesting moment for considering these types of moving image performances, and there's a reason that I don't want to call them film performances, because I think in a digital context, a lot of moving image performances by these artists stretch across like even more media context than what I'm talking about in terms of this 20th century work. And as Katie mentioned, I talked about in the code of my book, I think that it's probably not a huge revelation or controversial thing to say that visual albums that artists like Beyonce and Janelle Monáe and others have made are often more interesting arguably more interesting in various ways than some of their moving image work. Although I think Janelle Monáe's feature film acting career is very interesting. Because the visual album exists kind of in this open threshold space between the logic of the music video and the feature film, in which it adapts certain things from either without kind of fitting into either of those contexts, because it's not something that has to be projected on movie screens or fit within a television broadcast. That it is both open in terms of form, content, and things like that. And to me, that's one of the most exciting areas in which popular music artists today are doing this, particularly artists outside of the white male strictures amongst the most kind of prominent rock stars to moving image stars I talk about in my book. So but also, I mean, I think it's worth kind of thinking about that within larger casting practices too, especially in terms of feature filmmaking. So the 20th century, the period that I'm talking about in my book, is a period in which stardom is still something that is meaningful within Hollywood, in terms of just kind of the financial protection of filmmaking. But today, one might characterize it more as kind of intellectual property and franchises, as kind of replacing stardom as kind of a major locus of meaning. And so stardom is different, much less, music stars making a transition to film. And so right now we're kind of in a state in terms of film stardom that's difficult to define. But what some films have started doing, I'm forgetting the exact industry term for it, but is for ensemble films, casting known actors in roles for which they only need 1 to 2 days of time on set. For example, I think Meryl Streep in Into the Woods was an example of this. And I would see Beyonce's role in The Lion King as an example of a type of practice like this, where the point of the film and the way that the reason the film is being made is because of the IP, but by casting Beyonce, we kind of had this added value that's plugged into the film itself, even though what the film is doing doesn't really have all that much to do with Beyonce. But I don't know if Beyonce starring in The Lion King led to the visual album that she made that debuted on Disney Plus last year. It would be interesting to see if that was a quid pro quo, but I think that's an interesting area to explore.
Yeah, I think this is fascinating. And I think the point that you make about changes in the industry is absolutely apt, and changes in technology too, that we have these artists like Janelle Monáe, like Beyonce, like Grimes, who are able to create not necessarily filmic, but moving image depictions of these personae that are accessible to audiences in a different way. When Bowie wants to do Diamond Dogs, he has to borrow a video camera from RCA and film this in his hotel room, and then how is anyone ever going to see it, right? But with artists today, there are more platforms available to them, more modes of communication and engagement for their audiences. And I think that that's one of the interesting and telling differences, I suppose, between the 1970s moment that I'm looking at and the moment when we can see these artists exploring the idea of being an auteur of themselves, of their own characters, right? Of bringing Cindy Mayweather to the screen in different ways, or bringing any of the other characters that Monet plays, for example, to the screen in different ways. Oh, got a Bowie Instagram account. Heck yes, like an actual Bowie run Instagram account, if only.
All right. So Alex is back. Alex, do you want to unmute?
We're gonna hope that I can keep the tech. Yeah, so I was just sort of curious to hear your thoughts about Bowie playing Andy Warhol in Basquiat. It was a question that I had when I was reading Landon's book, and I understand why it's not in the study, but the Tesla anecdote made me think about it, particularly since, one, it comes at a time when like Warhol is getting a lot of different characterizations, like Crispin Glover plays him in The Doors. I think Jared Harris plays him in I Shot Andy Warhol at roughly the same time. But then in addition, like, it's such a rich sort of intertextual confluence between Bowie and Warhol because they were friends. They have a lot of the shared sort of thematic interests in terms of celebrity intertext, in terms of queer subculture, in terms of cinema. And it was a question that I had for Landon that I was just going to ask at a party whenever we see each other again. But it also seems like something that Katherine might be grappling with too. So it seemed worth asking. Was curious for your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot there in terms of everything that you just outlined. I think that's great. Unfortunately, I don't think that I have much more to say about it, about beyond the fact that I think it's after 1986 when Bowie is no longer appears in leading roles, but appears in these. The gangster film they made in the late 90s, is that
The Linguini Incident.
Oh, okay, right.
It's wonderful. It's so much fun. It's super charming.
So
sorry.
with my arbitrary kind of line on Labyrinth in 1986. But in terms of the films that quite frankly made me interested to know more about him, and Basquiat is definitely one of him. Know more about him as a film actor. That and Pontius Pilate in Last Temptation of Christ, and I see a lot of these roles as kind of roles in which he is merging his persona, as you say, Alex, with these known entities. In the case of Tesla and Pontius Pilate, he doesn't have the same relationship with them, but there is a merging of persona that's happening there that seems to speak to kind of a not only deliberate choice of roles, but deliberate choices made by others in terms of wanting to cast him in roles in which he's clearly not the lead of the film. That is something I would like to explore more. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't deal too much with the roles that could conceivably be called cameos. I think Sean Redmond has written a little bit about this, but the Bowie one is, the Warhol one is perhaps the most interesting for Bowie's reverence for Warhol. And as Len mentions in the chat, the somewhat disastrous meeting between them in 1971, I imagine that being able to play Warhol on film must have been tantalizing and deeply exciting for Bowie. That meeting is actually dramatized in last year's Stardust, which is perhaps not the best film and not the best adaptation of Bowie's life, but that moment of the meeting with Warhol is an interesting one and worth checking out if you're interested.
Yeah, I have to admit I haven't seen it, but he also was in a gangster film in the 90s with a British rapper. I'm forgetting the name of the film. I think it had two different names in the US and the UK, but I don't know much more about it. That's just in the recesses of his IMDb. Yeah, I also do admittedly kind of obscure the German films that he made in the late 70s and early 80s. Just a Gigolo, Christian F, and Ball, all of which, well, two of which I would say are very interesting.
Just a Gigolo has just gotten a Blu-ray release if you're
Oh.
interested in that.
Okay.
It's okay. Um, and worth seeking out just to see, I think.
Yeah.
And yes, I would agree, Glenn, absolutely.
Okay, so we have one more question. Our final question will be from Carl.
Yeah, thanks. This has been great, really fascinating. I guess there's a way I want to turn the story around a little bit, and I'm not sure how much either of you have worked on this, which is I'm wondering what the impact of his film work and other sort of media work in the 70s was at the point where he was still in North America kind of a cult artist and never quite succeeding at breaking through on a kind of pop level. And then on a flip side, when he had broken through on a pop level in North America in the 80s, there was the sense of betrayal that a certain amount of the cult audience had. And I think my impression is that some of that extended to things like him being in this kids film and things like that. So just in the whole sort of narrative arc of Bowie's career, how the positive and negative effects that this film work had on how his audience was perceiving him.
Well, I can say that if this isn't from the audience, but from his record label, there were, I'm not going to remember the quote now, but there's a quote about his songs in Labyrinth and how they don't really jive with Bowie of 1986. Like, we've got Bowie dancing around and throwing goblins and singing about puppies' tails, and that's not the David Bowie of today. So there's definitely a tension there for the people who are interested in capitalizing on Bowie's star image and the way that he's perceived in the public. But I will admit that I have not done a whole lot of reception-based research on how these roles had an impact for his fan base or how they might have been received. Landon, do you?
I don't know about how these roles kind of were received by his fan base, but the reception for most of the films that he made in his first 10 years of leading film roles is interesting in its consistency in terms of the fact that the majority of films that he was in underplayed theatrically and then developed a type of cult following. And so even with something like Labyrinth, which was clearly the biggest film that he made, the one that was supposed to be a large summer event, that did not end up happening. It had kind of a life of its own on home video. That also characterizes The Hunger, which was just eviscerated by critics when it first came out, developing a cult reception, particularly among goth fans. And there is an anthology on goth music that has an article a chapter dealing with, in part, with the reception of The Hunger. And then similarly with Man Who Fell to Earth, which was cut up into a shorter version for American release initially. And so it almost is like his film roles kind of match the story of his just general American reception in some ways, but also that to me kind of plays into the idea that Bowie's film roles and Bowie's value as a quote unquote movie star is constantly judged and evaluated by terms other than economic terms, by the value that he could lend to some of these films. Just personally, the first time I was introduced to David Bowie in my life was through Labyrinth. It was screened for me for whatever reason in a speech class when I was in 6th grade. And just personally, there's just something about him on screen. And so I'm kind of speaking more as a fan now. But in terms of my research, I kind of wanted to figure out what that is in terms of a larger industrial context. So I don't actually have an answer to your question, but that's my answer about how his movies were received.
I love that you saw Labyrinth in class. That's amazing.
learned a lot from it.
All right. Well, that was great conversation. Thank you so much to Katie and Landon. Please join us next week when Matt Brennan, Brian Wright, and Sue Foley will be here to talk about their respective books and books in process. Kick It, A Social History of the Drum Kit, The Bastard Instrument, A Cultural History of the Electric Bass, and Guitar Woman, Conversations and Life Lessons from the Heroines of Guitar. We hope to see you next week.
Thank you all so much.